Oh, sure. What happened is that I really was never that interested in these subjects until I had been working for a while with students, university students at the University of California in Los Angeles. I was working as a psychiatrist there in their student counseling center. And in that capacity, I saw hundreds and if not thousands, really, of students over the span of 12 years. And I noticed after a while that there was a steady stream of young people, mostly young women, who I was seeing, and they were suffering as a result of their the sexual decisions that they had made. For example, they either had a sexually transmitted infection, or perhaps they were worried about having HIV. They may be worried that they were pregnant, or they had just gone through an abortion, or had gone through an abortion some time ago, or perhaps they were just confused about a relationship, about their reactions to what's called hooking up. They would often come to me and say, these are primarily young women, what's wrong with me? I keep thinking about him. I never meant to get attached. I never meant to get emotional about it, but somehow, we hooked up a few times, and I barely know him, they'd tell me, but I can't stop thinking about him, and I'm wondering, does he have any feelings for me? And so they would really be in a fair amount of distress and say, what's wrong with me? So it was a double whammy, because number one, they had developed feelings for somebody that seemed not to be reciprocating those feelings, and number two, they felt there was something wrong with them for having developed those feelings. And so I began to get very interested in the hooking up culture and how my profession was dealing with that. Were we adequately informing young people about some of the risks of casual sexuality with multiple partners? Were we giving them up-to-date, medically accurate information? And I realized that we weren't doing those things, and in fact, I came to the conclusion that we are failing young people, especially young women, and that they are paying a very, very high price for it. So that's how all of this happened. I ended up writing my book, Unprotected, about some of the students that I had seen at UCLA. Each chapter described one or a few students who had a particular problem, whether it be infection with an STD or concern about HIV, like I said earlier, abortion. There's other subjects as well, how we fail to educate young people about their fertility, especially, again, young women. They have a window of fertility during their lives that stays open and then it closes. And so many of them are unaware of how that works and how the decisions that they make in their 20s and their 30s are very important, and that if motherhood is important to them, they need to be fully informed so that they can keep that option open. This is, of course, a very hot topic, very current, and I'm afraid that we are doing an absolutely terrible job of it. We're telling young people basically falsehoods, things that aren't true. First of all, let me begin with the definition of some words, because there's a vast misunderstanding of what the word gender actually means. most people think that the word gender is synonymous with the word sex. That, a child is born, you take one look, and generally, you can tell what its gender is, whether it's male or female. That's what most people think the meaning of the term gender is. That is not correct. And what they need to know is that the words sex and gender refer to two different things. Sex refers to a person's biological maleness or femaleness that is based on chromosomes and anatomy and hormones. And the word gender, which is a much more recent word, at least recent in terms of applying it to people. You see, the word gender used to be used only in grammar. It was used to describe nouns. We don't have this in English, but in French and Spanish and other languages we have nouns can be either male or female. So the word gender was used in that context. Is a given noun male or female? But the word sex was used to describe whether a person or an animal was male or female. But then something happened, and a researcher came along who became quite well known, John Money, and he advanced what he called gender theory. And for the first time, he applied the word gender to people instead of to nouns. And he used the term gender to describe this new idea. The new idea was that maleness and femaleness is really determined by how society, the messages that society gives a young child. That a young child, when it's born, when the baby is born, it's actually what he called gender neutral. It could grow up to feel like either a male or a female. So in this sense, his definition of gender was that it was a feeling, that maleness and femaleness is not based on anatomy and chromosomes. It's based on an inner experience, an inner feeling. And that was a revolutionary way of looking at maleness and femaleness. This happened in the 50s and 60s, that he advanced this theory that anyone, depending on how they're raised, could end up feeling like a male or a female. He hypothesized that in the first few years of life, that's when this determination is made, based on how a child is raised. My thoughts about that is that that theory could have conceivably had validity back in the 50s and 60s before we had the technology to look at genes and chromosomes and to map out the genome. At that time, it was thought that the Y chromosome, which I'll just remind you out there that the only difference in terms of chromosomes between a male and female is that a woman has two X chromosomes and a male has an X and a Y. So it's that Y chromosome that either makes a difference or not. And it was thought at the time of John Money, and when he came up with this theory of his, that the Y chromosome was essentially empty, that it was a genetic wasteland, and that therefore males and females, essentially, aside from a few minor things, had the same genetic endowment. If you believe that, if you don't have this up-to-date science that tells us otherwise, well then yes, you could argue that it's really society and socialization, the process of socialization, that's going to create maleness and femaleness, the kind of toys that you're given, the way you're dressed, and so on and so forth. But now we know that it's not so. And we have looked very closely at all human chromosomes, including the Y chromosome, and we know that it's absolutely packed with information that is unique to males. And we know that there's essentially a blueprint that is established at conception when the sperm and the egg meet, and it's determined at that moment whether the fetus, the embryo, later the fetus, is going to be either male or female. At that time, there's a blueprint created for either going in one direction or the other. Now, the default brain is the female brain. In other words, unless something happens in utero during development, the brain will go on to become a female type of brain. But what happens in males is that at 8 weeks, the Y chromosome sends out a message. And the message is for the testes of the little fetus to begin producing the hormone, the male hormone testosterone. And so when that happens, it affects the brain of the fetus and it turns it away from becoming a female brain and toward the male brain. Now this again is at 8 weeks post-conception, not after birth. 8 weeks after conception. So some women don't even have the awareness of being pregnant, and yet the brain of the fetus can be distinguished male or female. It's only beginning in that, toward that trajectory. It's going to continue as the fetus gets older, and of course, as the child later develops into an adult, those differences in the brain become more apparent. But they begin at 8 weeks post-conception. So the idea that we are born gender neutral and that everything comes from messages from society, we know is not so. We see differences between boy and girl babies in the first day of life, the first day of life. We continue to see differences as the child develops. We see differences at 1 year, at 2 years. Now, you could argue already that at 1 or 2 years, there's been a chance for parents and members of the family and so on to have an impact on the child's toy preferences and so on, but certainly not at 1 day. And I'll tell you something else that's fascinating. These differences between boys and girls are even seen in the animal kingdom. In other words, preferences for certain types of toys. We've been told now for decades that girls prefer dolls and boys prefer trucks just because that's what they've been given as children, and that's what the expectation has been of society on them. So there are these great experiments that have been done on juvenile monkeys. And juvenile boy and girl monkeys were given a choice of either dolls or cars and trucks, and to see what toys they would choose. And lo and behold, it was found that there was a preference also among juvenile monkeys, and that the girls went preferably for the dolls, and the boys went for the moving objects. This picture here shows a girl monkey grooming the little doll, baby doll, and the boy monkey is playing with a little police car. We must conclude from this study that there are gender stereotypes in the jungle. I'm not speaking here about every single boy and every single girl, or every man and every woman. I'm speaking about most. So like, with many things, there's a bell curve. Most people fall within, the closer to the center of the bell curve rather than out at the extremes. So while there are exceptions, of course, and stereotypes are dangerous in the sense that you don't want to assume that a given individual lies, in the center of the curve or to the extreme, and you just have to find out by getting to know that person and allowing for these differences. But it is fair to make this generalization and to say that there are significant inborn, unchanging differences between male and female in their preferred activities, in their perceptions, the way that they generally relate to others, the way they communicate, process information. There's a very long list of things that we see significant differences in aggression, in interest in sex, competitiveness, competitive play, rough and tumble play, and so on and so forth. No responsible scientist in this day and age would go on the record as saying that there are no significant inborn differences between male and female. We need to make a distinction here between two terms that many are confused about, and that is gender orientation and sexual orientation. Okay, gender orientation or gender identity would be a person's identity as male or female. And what's being promoted these days, in a very aggressive manner, is John Money's theory of gender, which is that it's all in the head. It's a feeling, it's an inner experience. And we're being told, John Money said that inner experience really was permanent, had been established, and would be unchanging by the age of about 3. But these days, we are leading people to believe, and especially, as you mentioned, vulnerable young people, that gender can be absolutely fluid and it can change throughout the lifespan, and a person can feel very comfortable and good as a male, and then at the age of 10 or 20 or 50 may decide that he actually feels like a female. This is what young people are being told. And there are individuals, rare individuals, who from an early age are persistently uncomfortable with being male or female because they feel they were born in the wrong body. They have the genetics, they have the chromosomes of one sex, but they feel like they must be another sex. That does exist. That's called gender identity disorder. And I certainly believe that these people need to be dealt with in a most sympathetic and understanding way, and given any help that they may need. What I object to is when children who don't have that and feel perfectly fine as male or female are told, there's a whole spectrum of ways that you might one day feel you are. You may, first of all, they say that there's a spectrum of gender identities. It's not just male and female, that those are the two extremes. There's many genders in between that, including not being either male or female. There's a whole smorgasbord of different gender identities, and I would object to that as not being scientifically accurate in terms of the vast, vast majority of the population. And then getting back to the terms, using the terms correctly, the term sexual orientation, which is completely different, and that refers to whether a person is romantically attracted to men or women or both men and women. So people are confusing these. There's lots of terms out there these days, and it's easy to get confused, but gender identity really is not absolutely related to who one is attracted to romantically. Well, first it's important to state that, again, the vast majority of individuals are attracted in a heterosexual manner. They have romantic attractions to the opposite sex. The numbers of people who identify as either gay, lesbian, or bisexual are actually quite small, and they are lower than what we are led to believe. The number that's generally out there is 10% of the population, and this is what students are told, 10% of the population, so that if you're in a class of 20 children, that means that typically 2 children in the class will be either gay, lesbian, or bisexual, and the statistics actually do not back that up. The statistics show that the numbers are much lower in the realm of, well, if you put the 3 categories together of gay, lesbian, and bisexual, and we're talking about people who identify in this way, not people who experiment or try things once or a few times in their lives. People who identify with one of these categories is more along the lines of 3 to 5%. It's so important to tell young people that no matter whether they think they're heterosexual or gay or lesbian, the most important thing is to delay sexual behavior. It's particularly true for boys who feel that they are certain that they're gay or they're wondering if they're gay, because the gay community has the highest, well, actually the bisexual and gay community has the highest incidence of infections, of genital infections. And so, you know, in order to stay healthy, and everyone wants our young people to stay healthy, it doesn't matter who they are. We want them to be healthy, to avoid infections, certainly to avoid HIV, so that they can grow up and live healthy and fulfilling lives. And they have the best chance of doing that if they delay sexual behavior until adulthood, and then once they are adults, they are with as few people as possible. So what concerns me so much is that all young people now who are exposed to what's called sexuality education get the message that it's healthy to be sexually active as a teen, and so long as they use protection, they can go ahead and explore and experiment with different people and discover what they like and what they don't like. I object to that message as a medical doctor. Becoming sexually active at a young age, having multiple partners, even if you use condoms each time, these are risk factors for getting infections and for getting HIV. They're risk factors for women to to have trouble with conceiving later on, with infertility later on, and a whole host of other issues as well. Now, people may not consider it realistic to urge young people to wait to become sexually active, but I disagree. I think that it is as realistic as urging young people to eat a healthy diet and keep away from junk food and not to drink and drive and not to go to tanning salons and et cetera, et cetera. We, in the health profession, our job is to present an ideal. Whether or not we think people are going to reach that ideal, we want to present it so that they're informed, they know what the ideal is, and they can strive toward it. And we encourage them, and we say, we know you can do it. And we have high expectations. And every time they come to our office, we remind them, you know, this is really the best lifestyle for you, to have a healthy weight and to get, you know, exercise and not to sit out in the sun without sunscreen, all those things. So sexual behavior needs to be on that list. It is healthiest, it is smartest for young people to delay sexual behavior. Sexuality education gives young people a false sense of security by telling them, use a condom and you'll be protected, more or less. You'll be protected enough. They'll use terms like condoms provide excellent protection, or condoms prevent infections, or they prevent pregnancy. This is only true to a certain degree, and it's much less so than you might imagine. The number that's given in terms of pregnancy prevention, that the effectiveness of condoms in preventing pregnancy, the number that is widely given is 98%. The 98% value holds for adult couples who are in long-term committed relationships who use the condom every single time and they use it correctly. So that's a lot. That's a lot of different qualifications that I put there. So first of all, it refers to adults. It doesn't refer to teens. It refers to adults that use condoms correctly every single time. That's perfect use. Most adults, even adults, typically aren't that good, so to speak. They're not using condoms every single time. Typical use in adults would be an effectiveness of about 85% in terms of preventing pregnancy. That's really not so high. Most people that are going for abortions who report having used birth control used condoms. So we're down to the 85% with adults' typical use. So with kids, with teenagers, who, number one, are less experienced, less responsible, more likely to use condoms incorrectly, that more likely to have sex after drinking or using drugs, the number is going to be below 85%. So condoms are not all that they are built up to be, and every health professional has seen somebody who has an unwanted pregnancy or went through an unwanted pregnancy and said, I really don't know how it happened because we used a condom. It's not unusual. I think that health professionals themselves probably are not as informed as they should be, many of them. And I will tell you that certain ideas have just been institutionalized, faulty ideas about safe sex about gender, what we were speaking about earlier, they've been institutionalized, and so it's harder to challenge them now, even though we have the science. There was a meeting that was held about 10 years ago by the National Institute of Health in near Washington, D.C., to specifically answer the question of how effective are condoms in preventing sexually transmitted infections. And a group of experts met for a week to discuss just that. And I'll tell you what their answer was. Their answer was, it depends. And for some infection, you see, the infections are different. Some of them are viruses that live on the skin. Herpes, for example, and the human papillomavirus, they live on the skin that may not be covered by the condom. And they can be passed from one person to another, even if there's no visible sign of a lesion or a blister or anything. The person may not even be aware that they have it. So that's, the viruses are different. And bacteria, which, such as chlamydia or gonorrhea, those are passed in the fluids themselves. So they are a bit better protected against by condoms. So it boils down to whether the condom is used properly, whether it's used every time. And so there's a great variability. But most teens report that in their last sexual interaction, they did not use a condom. And certainly, I don't know whether you want to get into the issue of oral sex, but the vast majority of young people are not using condoms during oral sex. And we know now that quite a number of sexually transmitted infections can be passed along in that way. And the newest information that we have is that there's a type of oral cancer, actually, that is can be dangerous, and it is associated with having had many oral sex partners. So, yes, I think that that young people are being given a false sense of security, and I think that the genital infections themselves are being whitewashed. They're worse than what's being portrayed to young people. There are organizations, there are physicians out there that are telling young people that you basically can't dodge these bugs, that when you become sexually intimate, you're going to get one of them. They can't be avoided. And I think that is a preposterous thing to do. I think it's a terrible thing to give young people the message essentially that when you become sexually active, you are going to get one of these illnesses, or you're going to get a bug. The ideal that's not being presented to young people, in which I think we're shortchanging them, the ideal that they can avoid all of these sexually transmitted infections if they delay sexual behavior and then they get together with another person who did the same. In that way, all these difficulties and stress and so on can be avoided. I'm referring actually to a video that's on YouTube that your listeners, your audience can go to. It's a Planned Parenthood, which here is called family planning here in Australia, but Planned Parenthood of the US has a very alarming video on YouTube with a doctor, Dr. Cullens is her name, and she informs young people that once they become sexually intimate, expect to have the human papillomavirus. She says, we all get it. And what happens is that they go ahead and normalize it and whitewash it. While it is true that many people seem to get rid of this virus, after a while their immune system is able to fight it and get rid of it, and perhaps they won't have it again for the rest of their lives, and it really ends up being quite a like a non-event in their life. That's true. That could happen, but it also could not. And sometimes people go on and have trouble with genital warts, and which can be quite devastating. It's hard to treat them, it's painful to treat them, and then more seriously, people can develop precancerous and cancerous lesions from this virus. I'll tell you something interesting. I was doing research on the history of sex education, and I came across the fact that in the 60s, it was widely believed by medical experts that we had seen the end of sexually transmitted infections. And that was because the two major ones at the time, gonorrhea and syphilis, now mind you, this was before the HIV epidemic, it was before herpes and the human papilloma were epidemic proportions, and it was following, it was at a time when antibiotics cured syphilis and gonorrhea with just one shot. So it was actually the Nobel Prize in Medicine, the winner of the Nobel Prize in Medicine, 1960, announced, we are seeing we are reaching a time when infectious disease will no longer be an issue for us. So what you just said, about no one would have imagined at that time. We have in the United States, another young person is infected with a sexually transmitted infection every 3.5 seconds. So yes, it is quite sobering, but I feel very optimistic, because the young people that I know, young people all over the world, want to be healthy. And they want to have a healthy lifestyle. They want to be free of sexually transmitted infections, and they have the ability to do that. When you think of the self-discipline that's necessary to do well in school or in sports, or to look good and to be attractive and so on, that also requires some degree of self-restraint and self-discipline, and we know that they can do it. So I feel very optimistic about it. They want the truth, they want the science. Well, first of all, adults, parents especially, grandparents need to be educated. The information is out there. I'm on a crusade to get the information out. I'm not the only person. There are other wonderful people and organizations doing this. I'll just throw in a plug for my own work. My website is www.miriamgrossmanmd.com. There's lots of great stuff on there. There's videos, there's information that can be downloaded that explains much more than what I've talked about today, about sexually transmitted infections, about gender, about HIV, a whole range of subjects. It's not politically correct, but it is scientifically accurate. It's actually science itself that isn't politically correct. And that's why I'm not, because I'm putting out there the latest research. So they can go to my website. I've written 2 books. The first one was called Unprotected, because it describes how I see young people, especially young women these days, as being vulnerable and unprotected. And then the second one was called You're Teaching My Child What? And it is based specifically on the history of sex education and how it's based on faulty thinking that is dangerous. We need to bring sex education into the 21st century. We have to, and we will.